In the 1840s, there was no such thing as air conditioning or heating. People traveling west on the Oregon Trail did their best to battle the elements, but often Mother Nature won. You may have already heard about or even played the classic computer game about this historic trail. You can also learn more about the people who traveled this route by visiting a website. Now back to the Oregon Trail. There are other videos here on the Oregon Trail experience, so be sure to check them out after this one. Let's get started. The ideal time to travel trip from Missouri to Oregon took most travelers between 4 and 6 months. For those covering the 2,170 miles, that meant averaging around 16 miles per day. That was including days of rest when the oxen needed to recover and families had a chance to catch up on household chores like cooking and cleaning. All told, travelers averaged about 35 miles a day. The entire journey was exhausting for everyone, but especially for the oxen. They pulled the wagons and carried cargo, supplies, and sometimes even passengers. Imagine living in the 1800s and having to travel thousands of miles by foot. Well, some travelers on the Oregon Trail did just that. On average, immigrants walked behind their wagon with a 3-day supply of food on their backs. The walking ox team covered about 15 miles a day, twice as fast as if they were pulling a wagon. But why not just leave the wagon behind? Well, immigrants had to take all of their belongings with them because they would eventually need them. Most planned to farm once they reached Oregon. Travelers couldn't afford to lose any of their precious cargo, so oxen were essential for getting through the trip. And since they were slow, stubborn creatures, they needed lots of rest. It wasn't uncommon for a traveler to shoot an ox and use its meat as food. Oxen were valued for their strength, longevity, and resistance to snake bite. An ox could pull a wagon carrying more than 2 tons. They lived longer than most cattle, which was good because getting replacement oxen was difficult. And finally, they were apparently immune to rattlesnakes, so they weren't afraid to step on them. While that last trait may sound a little scary, it was actually pretty helpful on the trail where rattlesnakes abounded. To keep to the 16-mile-per-day pace, the train needed to start early, in late April or early May. That way, travelers could beat the flooding season at the rivers and arrive in Oregon before the mountain passes were closed by snow. However, despite careful planning, few things could derail, pun intended, a trip on the Oregon Trail more than bad weather. Floods as soon as travelers left the safety of the well-worn path near Independence, Missouri, they entered the wild frontier. Floods were always a possibility. The Missouri River rose and fell with the seasons and could easily trap travelers without a proper boat. Any river crossing could turn into a fight for survival. Those who went afar from the riverbank risked quicksand. But even the most careful traveler couldn't control the weather. Storms could swell the river overnight, turning a shallow wade into a deadly torrent. If trapped by rising water, travelers had to abandon their wagons and belongings and hope for the best. Some lost their lives during these harrowing escapes. Others lost everything. When the waters receded, what hadn't been swept away by the current was ruined by the mud left behind by the flood. Even if the family survived, their journey was over. They simply couldn't pull a broken wagon full of muddy belongings across the country. Blizzards while spring floods were dangerous. Winter on the Great Plains was just as problematic. Blizzards could bury travelers alive, killing both people and oxen. In 1846, an early blizzard caught many immigrants by surprise. The storm hit without warning, lashing the train with sleet, freezing rain, and snow. By the end of the storm, several immigrants had died of exposure, and some wagons were buried under drifts of snow. Survivors struggled to dig out the buried wagons, but it was nearly impossible to move them. With the oxen unable to pull the heavy loads through the snow, travelers had only 2 options. They could wait for spring and hope the sun would melt the snow and dry out the ground. Or they could abandon their wagons and belongings and try to reach Fort Laramie, where they might find shelter and help. A smaller group of immigrants made the trek on foot, but only half of them survived. Those who waited out the winter in their buried wagons fared slightly better, though their situation was dire. Food supplies dwindled and temperatures plummeted. One child even froze part of her face off, but miraculously, no one died. Finally, when the sun finally melted the snow and ice, the immigrants set out again, traveling light, leaving behind their dead oxen and destroyed belongings. Heat and drought blizzards weren't the only storms that threatened travelers. Summer on the Great Plains could be brutally hot and dry. Without air conditioning or shade trees, the heat bore down on travelers mercilessly. Then there was the threat of wildfires. As the summer wore on, grasslands dried out and became tinderboxes just waiting for a spark. A careless campfire or even a lightning strike could send a wall of fire hurtling toward the next wagon train. People had to watch in horror as their belongings burned to ash and their animals roasted alive. To make matters worse, wildfires destroyed precious resources. When grass and crops withered and died, the soil became hardpan, making it almost impossible for oxen to pull wagons across the baked earth. The rutted ground also broke wagon wheels, and if a wheel broke, it could mean disaster for a family. Replacing a broken wheel could take days, meaning that the family would have to stay in one place for longer than they wanted. That could mean the difference between making it to Oregon before winter snows or being stuck in the plains and facing another brutal winter. Thunderstorms have been more common than floods, blizzards, or droughts were thunderstorms. Most were not dangerous, but rolled in and quickly passed, bringing much-needed rain and cooler temperatures. Sometimes, however, a thunderstorm turned violent. Lightning cracked, thunder boomed, and rain poured relentlessly from the sky. Families raced to erect their canvas shelters and batten down the hatches. High winds buffeted the small tents, threatening to tear them to shreds. Hailstones the size of marbles pounded the wagons, breaking windows and bruising flesh. Occasionally, a tornado touched down, causing unimaginable damage. Though rare, tornadoes were terrifying. If a tornado struck a camp, it could instantly obliterate the fragile shelters. People had to dive for cover and hope for the best. Extreme temperatures, it came to battling the elements on the Oregon Trail. Sometimes the worst conditions were the ones that seemed nicest. Spring and fall could bring warm, sunny days and clear skies. This seemed like a break in the danger, but it was a false promise. See, the temperature could change in an instant, and people weren't prepared for that. Immigrants often found themselves caught in the middle of a sudden cold snap. At night, temperatures plummeted, surprising travelers who hadn't anticipated the chill. People huddled around campfires, trying to warm themselves and their oxen. But fires couldn't always keep the cold at bay. Early in the morning of October 24, 1848, the temperature stood at a balmy 55 degrees Fahrenheit. But by 3 p.m., a sudden cold front had arrived, dropping the temperature to 18 degrees. People struggled to get their fires going in the cold. Others watched helplessly as their oxen froze to death. Some families abandoned their oxen, hoping to find them later, but they never did. In the end, 5 people died of exposure, including a woman and 3 children. Other times, the heat was unbearable. Summers in the Great Plains routinely reached into the 90s and even 100 degrees Fahrenheit. People had to wear light clothing and drink plenty of water to avoid overheating. But even that wasn't always enough to stave off the worst effects of the heat. On July 21, 1849, the temperature climbed to an unbelievable 115 degrees. People could do nothing but lie around in the shade and wait for the day to pass. Winter Reef surviving the heat, drought, tornadoes, and storms wasn't enough. Travelers also had to contend with winter on the Oregon Trail. Winter on the Great Plains was bitterly cold and could last for months. Snow piled up and buried travelers. Winds gusted across the barren landscape, and ice formed on every surface. No matter where someone went, they could hear the wind whistling through the bare branches of trees or feel the cold seeping into their bones. Just as important, winter brought a different kind of loneliness. During the long summer days, travelers could see other wagon trains in the distance, their camps bustling with activity. But in the winter, when most people stayed inside their wagons or buried themselves under blankets, nights dragged on and people rarely ventured out. Most immigrants who died on the Oregon Trail died in the winter of 1848 to 1849. Of the 3,500 immigrants who traveled west, 2,000 of them didn't make it. Many lost their lives to cold exposure, while others succumbed to diseases like cholera and smallpox. For more about the deadliest trails in American history, stay tuned. Thanks for watching. Canvas is not waterproof. It absorbs water. It sags. It leaks. Everything. Your food, bedding, clothes is soaked. And there are no dryers on the prairie. Life on the trail is hard. But what is it really like? Is it just a little more difficult than modern life? Or how much harder was it really? When we think about pioneers and the Oregon Trail specifically, we imagine a rough and ready bunch of determined folks who pushed across an unsettled continent so they could make a fresh start somewhere west of the Mississippi. We picture them driving their covered wagons across the plains with oxen or perhaps horses. We see them fishing, hunting buffalo, and building new lives in the wilderness. But what was that life really like? What did the pioneers experience? How did they feel as they traveled? Let's find out. The hardships of the Oregon Trail are legendary. People today don't travel the way the pioneers did. We have paved roads, plenty of gas stations, and hotels along our routes and cell phones to call for help if we break down. Back then, there was no road maintenance, few services, and isolation that would be almost impossible for us to imagine. There are many dangers on the road, but none quite as terrifying as the forces of nature. No matter how good a car you have, there's nothing that can keep you safe from a tornado, blizzard, or hailstorm. And the weather on the Great Plains is volatile. Thunderstorms were common on the Great Plains and often terrifying. Lightning lit up the skies in great, branching forks, and thunder rolled like cannon fire. Winds could reach speeds strong enough to knock over a wagon. Tornadoes weren't unheard of. Imagine being inside that swirling vortex of awfulness as it picks up your home and hurls it through the air. No wonder the settlers called these regions the Great American Desert. When rain fell, the dirt roads quickly turned into thick, sticky mud, slowing the train to a crawl or stopping it altogether. Sometimes travelers had to abandon their wagons and teams and walk for days until they could rejoin the train. If a storm hit while the train was stopped, the travelers were in even worse shape. In his book, The Oregon Trail, Francis Parkman wrote, "We sank in a cloud of dust which hung over the road and filled our eyes, nose, and mouth with fine powder so that we looked and felt as if we had been sifting plaster." Hailstorms added another layer of misery. Ice the size of marbles, and sometimes larger, would pelt down from the sky, injuring travelers and animals, damaging wagons, and scaring the oxen into stampedes. The travelers slept in their wagons, which had no insulation, so they were at the mercy of the elements. If the nights got cold, the people inside got cold too. Shivering children huddled under thin blankets, and fires were sometimes impossible to light in wet conditions. Hypothermia was a real danger, even in late spring or early autumn. Then came the summer heat. Inside a canvas box with no air conditioning, temperatures could rise to 120 degrees or more. One traveler wrote, "It was so hot that butter would melt in a very few minutes, and eggs sizzled in the sun. The chickens were too hot to lay eggs, and the cows gave very little milk, and mosquitoes and other biting insects made life miserable." Travelers rolled up their trousers and tucked their shirts into their belts to reduce the number of bites. Others wore mosquito netting over their heads. Even so, the insects often found their way inside the wagons, and bites could lead to serious infections. Travelers faced another danger that didn't involve nature. They had to cross rivers, and when the waters rose, they couldn't always find a safe way across. Sometimes they had to swim for the bank with their animals behind them, holding onto each other for dear life. Other times they tried to ride their horses across only to be swept away by the current. Some travelers lost their lives in the rivers, and many lost important supplies that were ruined by water. One traveler described the scene after a particularly tragic crossing of the Republican River in 1867. He wrote, "The river had risen during the night, and a brother and two sisters who had attempted to ford it were swept away by the current and drowned. Their bodies were found embedded in the sand on a low island below the crossing place. 3 graves were dug, 2 for the sisters, 1 for the brother. The party went into camp and the next day continued their journey. In addition to facing dangerous weather, wild animals, and swift rivers, travelers had to deal with the effects of isolation and boredom. Days on the trail were long and uneventful. Most people walked behind their wagons. The pace was slow, and there was little to see but grass and the occasional tree. Children often got bored and wandered off. They also got tired of eating the same food over and over. On the trail, most of the food was dried and families had to cook it over an open fire. Rations included hardtack, a type of cracker, dried meat, flour, coffee, and sometimes rice and sugar. Alcohol was also common, and some travelers kept diaries, writing about the endless monotony of the trail and the boredom that resulted in fights among travelers. Now, add to this the constant threat of disease, and you have a perfect recipe for despair. Disease was everywhere on the trail, and it wasn't always cholera and typhoid fever that made people sick. Travelers suffered from simple things like colds, sore throats, earaches, and insect-borne illnesses. Most of the time, medicines were in short supply, so the sick were often left to wait until they got better on their own. But some diseases were so bad that the travelers had to take drastic measures. For example, when a child developed smallpox, the family had to leave the train and hide in the hills until the disease ran its course. This was the best way to protect the rest of the group because smallpox was highly contagious. If the disease spread through the camp, it could wipe out the entire company. There is no question that those who traveled the Oregon Trail were tough. Not only did they face terrible conditions, but they also had to deal with personal loss. Someone died every day on the Oregon Trail. Travelers died from snake bites, drowning, starvation, exposure, murder, suicide, and disease. Babies died as often as anyone else, and that included men, women, and children. A traveler named Sarah Royce Bicknell wrote about the death of a young girl named Mary. She wrote, "She was the pet of the company, and her death cast a gloom over all. We buried her on the bank of the Little Blue River. The wind rising in the evening took the lid off the coffin, and we could not replace it, and it floated away on the current. I hope it has reached the ocean and that Mary is at rest." It is estimated that as many as 20% of travelers died and were buried along the Oregon Trail. That's why today you can still find graves along the route 150 years later. Traveling on the Oregon Trail was an incredible feat. It required planning, determination, and grit. It also required ignoring the naysayers who said it couldn't be done. These pioneers were strong, brave, and independent, and they changed the course of American history. It might be fun to imagine we could just pack up and head out on a covered wagon train across the unsettled lands of America. But it was anything but fun. Life on the trail was cheap, dangerous, dirty, and difficult. Add to that the fact that the journey took months, and you'll understand why so few people dared to try it. It's me. This is our wagon train, and we're headed west. Let's go. Once the trail reached the plains of Nebraska and into the parched lands of Wyoming, the sun became a punishing enemy. Shade was a luxury, trees were scarce, The trail was dusty, and the dust clung to everything. It coated our clothes, our food, our faces. It choked our throats, stung our eyes. By midday, wagons baked in the sun, becoming ovens. Water barrels warmed quickly, and drinking water often tasted of wood, dirt, and decay. So people rationed it, even as their lips cracked and their skin burned. Sunburns, heat stroke, and exhaustion hit travelers hard. Animals fared no better. Oxen collapsed under the weight of the wagons, and many had to be left behind. A terrible risk that could leave a family stranded. By late afternoon, the temperature began to drop. We made camp wherever we could find shade, often just 2 or 3 cottonwoods along the riverbank. At night, the thermometer dropped to the 40s and 50s. Some nights it was colder than others. That's when the cold seeped into your bones and made it hard to get up in the morning. Mornings were always the hardest. The cold seeped into your bones and made it hard to get up. While everyone in the wagon train struggled with the harsh conditions, some did better than others. Those who struggled the most were the women. They cooked meals, they washed clothes, they cared for children, and all the while they battled exhaustion and the elements. Then there were the children. Their little bodies couldn't take the strain of long marches and hard work. Sometimes the children complained, but most of the time they were too tired to do anything but sit in the wagon and stare at the ground. As for me, I felt like I was getting stronger, tougher. The trail was teaching me lessons about myself that I never knew I needed. One day, Captain Daikinel spoke to us from atop an overturned bucket. He stood tall and thin in his buckskins, a wide-brimmed hat shading his face. His eyes glittered like sun on steel. "Look yonder," he said, pointing toward the north. "Do you see those clouds? Dark as they are our salvation. For days now, the sky has been the color of dirty linen, and the sun beats down upon us mercilessly. But these clouds may bring us rain." Sure enough, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Soon fat raindrops began to fall. The parched earth drank it in. The grass unfurled its thirsty leaves. Travelers lifted their faces to the sky and sighed with happiness. The rain swelled into a torrent, then subsided into a light drizzle. Soon the clouds were gone and the sun came out again, sparkling on a freshly washed world. Capped, Kenedal stood once more before the assembled travelers. "I have news," he said, spreading his arms wide. "The treaty is signed. The Navajo are going to their reservation, and peace has come to the frontier. We can go home." Cheers erupted, and when the din had died down, Kennedy raised his hand for silence. "But first," he said, "we must bury Littlefoot. He died yesterday of exposure. He was one of the bravest, most untiring workers I ever saw. May he rest in peace." All of us filed past the wagon where Littlefoot lay covered with a blanket. Mrs. Sanchez knelt by the grave. "God damn that treaty," she spat, her eyes blazing. "He was killed for nothing, nothing but land. Land that was his and his alone. God damn that treaty." She threw a handful of dirt onto the coffin and stalked away. The captain watched her go, his face troubled. "She's right," he muttered, "but what can we do?" As the days passed, we came across other graves, each one a reminder of the cost of progress. Sometimes travelers would gather around a fire after supper and tell stories. There were ghost stories and campfire yarns, but mostly they were stories about home. We missed our families and friends, and those stories helped ease the ache of being away. One evening, while the men told stories about hunting buffalo and fighting Indians, a girl named Bess told a story of her own. Bess was the daughter of the wagon master. Her father was a large, gruff man who kept mostly to himself. But Bess had a sweet voice and a quick smile, and she was one of my best friends on the trail. "Once upon a time," she began, "there was a king who lived in a faraway castle. Every night the king dreamed that a great flood was coming. It would sweep through his kingdom and wash away all the people. Every night the king dreamed the same dream? and every morning he woke up and thanked God it was only a dream. But one morning he woke up and the flood was there. The king ran to the window and looked out. The river had overflowed its banks and was pouring through the streets. People ran, screaming, trying to save their homes and their children. The king grabbed his sword and ran to the door. "Help me," he cried. "Help me save my kingdom." But nobody came. The people were all gone. The king ran outside and waded into the water. The water rose around him, and he struggled to stay upright. "Help me," he screamed, but no one answered. The water reached his waist, then his hips, then his chest. The king thrashed in the water, but it was too late. The flood had come, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The water swept through the streets, washing away houses and trees, washing away the king's hope and his pride. The water rose and rose until it was over his head, and then he was gone. Nobody knows what happened to the king, but sometimes, in the middle of the night, you can hear him crying as the water pulls him farther and farther down. A chill wind blew through the camp, rustling the leaves in the trees overhead. Everyone stared into the flames, lost in thought. Finally, someone asked, "What does it mean?" Bess shrugged. "Dreams are dreams," she said. "But sometimes dreams tell you things will change." We all nodded, though none of us really understood what Bess's story meant. But deep down, we knew things had changed. We weren't the same people who had set out from Missouri. The trail had been hard and unforgiving, but it had taught us lessons about ourselves and about life. And when we reached California, we would be a different kind of pioneer. We would be strong, tough, and resourceful. Then, one day, something terrible happened. The dust storm struck our camp and lasted for hours. I don't remember how long we waited for it to pass, but eventually the wind shifted and the sun came out again. When the storm was over, everything was coated in dust. Our clothes, our food, our bedding, we coughed for hours. Our animals panicked and we wondered, briefly, if it could get any worse. But then we remembered the mountains. The Rockies loomed ahead of us, dark and imposing. We traveled for weeks through the foothills, climbing higher and higher. The air grew colder and the pine trees thicker. Then, one morning, we reached the Continental Divide. Captain Kennedy stood at the top of the rise, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He turned and addressed us. "Friends, we have crossed the Great Divide." From here on out, we traveled downhill to the Pacific. Cheers went up and we began our descent. The trail wound through forests and across rocky slopes. One afternoon, we came upon a group of men who were working on a new section of road. They looked hard and hot and thirsty. We stopped to help them, and when we had finished, they gave us directions to a ranch where we could rest. The next day, we found the ranch. It was little more than a cluster of tents and huts, but there was a spring nearby with good water and plenty of it. That night, we made a big supper and sat around a roaring fire, telling stories and laughing. It was good to be alive, good to be with friends. We stayed at the ranch for 3 days, resting and recuperating. Then we said goodbye and continued on our way. We traveled for several more weeks, and finally, on October, we reached the end of the trail. We had traveled more than 2,000 miles, and it seemed like a miracle that we had survived. When we first started out, there had been 87 wagons in our train. Now there were only 36. Of the more than 1,000 people who had set out from Missouri, only about 600 remained. Nearly 400 had died on the trail. Some had been killed by Indians, some by accident, and some simply because the trail was too much for their bodies to bear. But we had made it. We had crossed the continent and built a new life for ourselves in California. And as I stood on the beach watching the sunset over the Pacific, I knew that no matter what hardships we faced in the future, we could face them together. This is the end of our story. If you enjoyed this episode and want to see more like it, please subscribe and leave a review. Also, be sure to check out our social media for more historical tales. Thanks for watching. When people today plan a road trip, they want a couple things: a fun destination, a good playlist, and maybe a pit stop at a retro-themed diner somewhere along the way. Back in the 1800s, pioneers traveling the Oregon Trail had slightly different priorities. Sure, getting to Oregon was pretty great, but all they really wanted was not to die. Because while the Oregon Trail is remembered today as a historic path to the Pacific Northwest, back then it was more like a long game of Frogger than a scenic byway. There were rivers to ford, mountains to climb, and a few deadly critters looking to end your run in the middle of nowhere. But by far, the greatest danger on the Oregon Trail was the weather. The final obstacle was the most feared: the Blue Mountains and the Cascades. By the time travelers reached these ranges, it was late in the journey, often September or October. And in those parts, winter didn't wait patiently. Snow could come early, trails could freeze overnight. Wagons became sleds, oxen slipped on the ice. Campsites became treacherous, and the cold seeped into every joint and bone. Firewood was hard to find, and wet clothes froze stiff in the night air. Many families found themselves trapped in the mountains, too weak or late to continue. The most infamous of these was the Donner Party, who took a different trail west, the Hastings cut off, and became stranded in the Sierra Nevada during a brutal winter. Their story ended in starvation, death, and, eventually, cannibalism. While that was a rare and extreme case, it haunted the minds of Oregon Trail travelers. Everyone knew that nature could turn from majestic to murderous in an instant. To be fair, most travelers knew what they were getting into when they set out east. When you sign up for a trek along an unmarked mountain path, you should kind of expect the unexpected. And Mother Nature can be an unpredictable beast. In the 1800s, pioneers usually traveled during the warmer months, which meant their journey began in the spring. That sounds like a smart idea, right? Well, sometimes the spring would bring raging rivers that made fording almost impossible and destroyed bridges, creating impassable obstacles on the trail. Plus, when pioneers started their journeys, many of them still had to deal with snow, especially if they were heading north. After the spring thaw came the summer, which was actually probably the best season to travel. Most of the snow had melted by this point, and there were fewer obstacles between supply depots. Travelers could also rely on berries and fruit to supplement their food stores. If you picked wild berries, though, you had to make sure you knew which ones were safe to eat. And even those weren't always reliable. Sometimes the seasons would get mixed up and the fruit and berries wouldn't ripen until late in the journey. So travelers had to press on with little sustenance. As summer faded into fall, the temperatures dropped. The days grew shorter and the nights got colder. Storms and muddy conditions also made supplies spoil faster. And as the pioneers climbed higher into the Rockies, they faced new challenges, including the infamous mountain sickness. The thin air at high altitudes gave some travelers a terrible headache and nausea, making it nearly impossible to keep going. At least travelers didn't have to worry about being too sick to spot wildlife along the trail. There were plenty of animals to see, but most of them wanted nothing to do with humans. Some of the bigger animals, like bison and elk, were scary enough to avoid. But smaller animals could also pose a danger, especially snakes. Rattlesnakes were common along the Oregon Trail, and bites could mean certain death unless you had access to medical care. And even if you did, the anti-venom might not arrive in time. And then there were mountain lions, bears, and wolves, whose hunger knew no season. Finally, after all those perils, travelers would reach the Blue Mountains and the Cascades, where winter could arrive at any moment, whether it was the middle of December or the end of September. For a moment, let's imagine that we are indeed pioneers on the Oregon Trail. We've made it this far. It's been a harrowing journey, but our oxen are strong, our wagon is sturdy, and we're feeling pretty optimistic about reaching the end of the trail. Then winter hits. How do we escape the frozen wasteland? Well, first off, let's think about how we'd keep ourselves alive. Food and water are our top priorities. Luckily, we brought enough food on the journey to last several weeks. Maybe we even have some extra now that our journey is taking longer than expected. As for water, well, hopefully we're near a river that hasn't frozen over yet. And because our wagon is sturdy, we can fill up our water containers and cover them tightly so the freezing temperatures don't turn our water into a giant block of ice. To stay warm, we need to make a shelter that will protect us from the elements. Luckily, we're pretty experienced campers by now, so setting up a tent shouldn't take too much time. Then we'll need to build a fire to keep nice and toasty inside our tent. But wood can be hard to come by in snowy landscapes. Maybe we can find some dry wood under a fallen log. Perfect. Now we can hang up our wet clothes and blankets so they can dry out and warm up a bit before we wear them again. Then we'll snuggle up together, tell some ghost stories, and wait for the weather to improve. Okay, so that plan makes sense in theory, but there's one problem. You can't really camp in sub-zero temperatures. Your tent will freeze solid, your water will freeze solid. Even your blankets won't offer much protection. You might not die, but you also won't be the same ever again. Long-term exposure to such low temperatures can cause permanent damage to your fingers and toes. And those are just the lucky cases. People could go blind, suffer organ failure, or lose limbs to frostbite. Now, let's say we were prepared for the cold and we had the right gear. We've got insulated boots, parkas, gloves, goggles, hats, and scarves. We've got hand warmers and toe warmers and plenty of non-perishable food. We even have a sled to help our oxen pull our supplies across the snow. What could possibly go wrong? Well, for starters, our oxen could still slip on the ice and injure themselves or us. Our sled could break. A mountain lion could still attack, or an avalanche could bury our campsite and take our lives. Sure, we have a plan and we're better prepared than most, but Mother Nature doesn't play favorites. She doesn't care how much planning you've done or how prepared you are. She just unleash whatever she's got and hope for the best. So yes, the odds of surviving the Oregon Trail were slim. For every 1,000 pioneers who started the journey, only about 900 made it to the end. Of course, that's a lot of people, but it also means that roughly 10% of travelers died during the trek. Over 2,000 people perished on the Oregon Trail, most of them from disease or starvation. And it wasn't until the 1860s when railroads offered an alternative that the trail finally started to fall out of use. Today, you can visit reconstructed versions of the Oregon Trail at living history museums in Nebraska and Wyoming. And if you're really brave, you can try to recreate the whole experience for yourself using a 19th century style wagon. But if you're not brave, you can stick to visiting the museums. And you won't have to worry about dying of exposure, starvation, or even worse, a sudden attack of dysentery. When you think of the Oregon Trail, do you imagine struggle? Maybe you picture your third grade classroom with rows of desks facing forward, all turned toward the chalkboard where a map is marked with difficult terrain, disease, starvation, exhaustion, death. Because while it's true that thousands died on the Oregon Trail, thousands more made it to Oregon. And along the way, they didn't just suffer. They laughed, played, explored, hunted, prayed, sang, ate, drank, read, wrote, gambled, and danced. Life on the trail, in all its hardship, also offered moments of beauty, wonder, and grace. So in this episode, we're going to pull back the curtain a bit and take a look at what life on the Oregon Trail might have been like on a more typical day. What would someone have done, seen, heard, eaten, worn, hoped for, or worried about? What could they not live without? And what, if anything, could they have left behind? We're going to start with what they could not leave behind, and yet they pressed on. How? Why? Because they had no choice. Turning back was nearly impossible. Supplies were carefully measured for a one-way journey. The further they traveled, the more dangerous it became to retreat. And so, no matter how brutal the weather, how wet the bedding, how cracked the lips, or frostbitten the fingers, they trudged forward. Forward through the storms, forward through the heat, forward through snow, mud, hail, lightning, and dust, because the dream of a warm home, of fertile land, of safety and ownership still burned brighter than the weather's fury. Imagine for a moment that you are on the Oregon Trail. You might be an 18-year-old woman who has traded her hoop skirt for more practical clothing, or a middle-aged man whose calloused hands grip the reins. Perhaps you're a curious child with eyes wide at the wonders around you, or a parent clutching a baby close while your other children walk alongside. Maybe you're a mix of all these things, an adult with a wife, kids, and a mother in tow. And maybe you have a few extra possessions, a luxury some did not have. Whatever your situation, you must keep moving. It's imperative to rise before sunrise and start the day with the first light. There is much to do. First, you need to feed everyone and make sure there's enough food for later. If there are oxen or horses to care for, it's time to get them ready to move again. Then there are the children to dress, the bed to pack up, and then the family itself to gather together and set out. Before leaving camp, though, it's important to check for visitors. As many travelers did, you greet them warmly and perhaps share a meal. Depending on who arrives, you might stay put for a day or two until others catch up. That's because traveling alone is dangerous, but together you can help each other. The idea is to move as a group, relying on each other to survive. This is your new family now. You stop each evening to set up camp and do it all over again. Eat, take care of animals, attend to children, sleep, pray, fix equipment, cook, wash clothes, socialize, prepare for bed. Each day is much like the last, except for the beautiful views you witness every morning. After a hard day of walking and work, there may be time for fun. You could play dominoes or euchre. Maybe someone will tell stories around the campfire or sing a song. A fiddle or a concertina might play lively tunes, and soon people will be dancing. Sometimes travelers came across friendly Native Americans who shared their skills and knowledge. If you want to continue learning about the culture and history of the region, and now it's time for bed. Wet and cold is how most travelers described it. No one gets much sleep. The ground is hard and uncomfortable. You tuck in tightly to keep warm, hoping to catch a few winks before the sun comes up again. The routine never changes, yet every day is different. The weather shifts quickly along the trail, requiring travelers to adjust to the unexpected. Storms, floods, heat waves, and blizzards all tested travelers' endurance. To understand what life was like on the Oregon Trail, you can't just consider the good times or the bad, but both together. Sometimes it rained, sometimes it hailed, sometimes the river rose, and sometimes the river fell. Sometimes a lone ox suffered from the heat or a horse stumbled and broke its leg. Sometimes people found gold or rare minerals. Sometimes they discovered beautiful flowers or petrified palm wood. Sometimes they saw deer or antelope or buffalo. Sometimes they picked ripe berries or dug for roots. Sometimes they met kind strangers, and sometimes they were lonely or homesick. Sometimes they caught fish or shot a squirrel. Sometimes their plows hit stones or got stuck in the mud. Sometimes they celebrated birthdays or the 4th of July. Sometimes a child was born and sometimes a person died. Sometimes they walked barefoot and sometimes they wore leather moccasins. Sometimes they ate bread and pork, beans and potatoes. Sometimes they roasted a whole suckling pig. Sometimes they boiled tripe and sometimes they pickled onions. Sometimes their hair grew long or their beards grew heavy. Sometimes they washed their clothes or wore the same dress for weeks. Sometimes they sat on logs or bent over to tie their shoes. Sometimes they stood for hours, and sometimes they crawled on the ground. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes they cried, sometimes they sang. Sometimes they told stories, and sometimes they prayed. Sometimes they were scared, and sometimes they were brave. Sometimes they were happy, and sometimes they were sad. Sometimes they were hopeful, and sometimes they were discouraged, but always they moved forward. That's what it was like on the Oregon Trail. Not always easy, not always joyful, not always hopeful, but always real. Now, let's hear from you. How does this portrait of life on the Oregon Trail change or confirm what you already knew or thought you knew? What surprised you? What do you think we missed? And what else would you like to know about this time period? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more historical tales, including stories about the pioneers who traveled the Oregon Trail to settle the American West. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on the channel.